He was standing in my kitchen, going through my mail, when he didn't know I was home. I had come back from my cardiologist appointment early. The waiting room was packed, and Dr. Okokofor had squeezed me in fast, bless him. And I pulled into the garage quietly because my neighbor Patty was out front with her new dog, and I didn't want to get stopped for 20 minutes of small talk. So I came in through the side door, the one off the laundry room, and I set my purse down on the dryer the way I always do. That's when I heard him. He wasn't trying to be quiet. That was the thing that stayed with me afterward. He wasn't even trying. He was just moving through my house like he owned it. Drawers opening and closing. The little wooden box I keep on the counter by the phone, the one my late husband Harold gave me for our 30th anniversary, I heard that sliding across the tile. I stood in the laundry room for a long moment and I didn't breathe. My son-in-law. In my house. On a Tuesday afternoon when he was supposed to be at work. I need to back up. Because this didn't start that Tuesday. This started 14 months earlier, the night my daughter called me crying so hard I could barely understand her. Her name is Becca. She's 34, a dental hygienist, and she has her father's eyes, that particular shade of gray-green that changes in different light. She married Scott 2.5 years ago and I tried. I genuinely tried to love him. He was charming at the wedding, funny during the rehearsal dinner, the kind of man who makes a good impression in short doses. My late sister used to say that about certain people, good in small doses, and I've come to understand exactly what she meant. The call came on a Wednesday night in November. Becca was crying, and she said they were behind on rent. 3 months behind. She said Scott had lost his job. Not been laid off, lost it, there's a difference she glossed over, and that their landlord had filed an eviction notice. And could she please come stay with me, just until they got back on their feet. I live in a 3-bedroom house in Dayton, Ohio. I've been here 31 years. Harold and I raised Becca and her brother Kyle in this house. After Harold passed 8 years ago, I rattled around in it for a while, feeling the emptiness in every room, and then I found my rhythm again. I have my garden. I have my church group. I have my neighbor Patty and her ridiculous new labradoodle. I was fine. But she was my daughter, and she was crying. I said yes. I told myself it would be 2 months, maybe 3. Scott would find work, they'd save up a deposit, they'd get back on their feet. I told myself I was helping. I told myself this was what mothers did. They arrived on a Saturday with a U-Haul that was fuller than I expected. Scott carried boxes in without making eye contact with me for the first hour. Becca kept apologizing and touching my arm and saying, "Thank you. Mom, I mean it. Thank you." I made chicken and rice for dinner and Scott ate 2 plates without commenting on the food, and then sat down in Harold's armchair and turned on the television. Harold's armchair. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was just a chair. The first few weeks were manageable. Becca was working her regular schedule at the dental office. Scott was ostensibly job hunting. He'd sit at the kitchen table with his laptop in the mornings and say things like, "I've got a few interviews lined up and I'm being selective. I don't want to just take anything." I nodded. I kept my opinions to myself. But things started to shift around week 4 or 5. Small things at first. Scott started going into my home office. I'd converted the 3rd bedroom into an office after Kyle went to college. It's where I do my bills, where I keep Harold's files, where I have a small safe bolted to the floor in the closet. I'd come home and find the office door open when I'd left it closed. Once I found a pen on the floor that had been on my desk. I told myself I was imagining things. Then he started asking questions. He asked, very casually one morning over coffee, whether Harold had left me a life insurance payout. He framed it as concern. "Just want to make sure you're financially secure, you know, at your age." I was 63 at the time. I told him Harold and I had planned carefully and I was doing fine. He nodded like I'd told him something useful. A week later, he asked about the house. Was it paid off? What was it worth, roughly? Had I ever thought about downsizing? I started locking my office. He noticed immediately. He didn't say anything directly, but I caught him trying the handle twice that first week. Just trying it, casually, like he was passing by. The second time he saw me watching him from the hallway and he smiled. This particular smile he had, tight and practiced, and said, "Oh, sorry, habit. I was just looking for the bathroom." The bathroom was in the other direction. We both knew it. I called my son Kyle that night. Kyle lives in Columbus, an hour away, and he'd been skeptical of Scott from the beginning in the quiet, loyal way he had. He never said anything openly against his sister's husband, but there'd been a long pause on the phone when I'd told him Scott and Becca were moving in. One of those pauses that says everything. I told Kyle what was happening. He listened without interrupting, which is very Kyle. When I finished, he said, "Mom, I think you need to talk to someone." Not me. A professional. He meant a lawyer. I called my estate attorney the next morning. Her name is Ms. Whitfield, and she's been handling my affairs since Harold died. She's in her 50s, practical, no nonsense, the kind of woman who doesn't waste words. I told her what was happening. She didn't seem surprised. She said, "Have you noticed anything missing? Any documents moved?" I said not that I could tell, but I wasn't sure. She said, "Change the access code on your safe if you have one, and if you can, document the behavior, dates, times, specific incidents. If he's fishing for financial information, he's building towards something." I changed the safe code that afternoon. The safe itself was a good one. A cannon gun safe that Harold had bought years ago, bolted through the floor of the closet into the foundation. It required a 6-digit code and a key. I kept the key on my person at all times after that. In my pocket during the day, on my nightstand at night. I also started writing things down. I have a small spiral notebook, blue cover, and I started keeping it in my purse. Every incident, every question, every time I found the office door wrong. Dates and times. Ms. Whitfield had said document, so I documented. Around month 3, Scott stopped pretending to job hunt. He'd be home when I got back from errands, watching television. He'd started using my streaming accounts. I noticed because my continue watching queue was full of shows I'd never seen. He ate my groceries without replacing them. Once I came downstairs at 6 in the morning and found him in my kitchen reading my bank statement. I had left it on the counter because I'd meant to file it and forgotten. He looked up when I came in. No embarrassment, just that tight smile. He said, "Morning. Hope you don't mind. I was just looking for a pen." There was no pen near the bank statement. There was a full cup holder of pens 12 inches from his elbow. I picked up the statement, folded it, and put it in the pocket of my robe. I said good morning, and I started the coffee maker. My hands were very steady. I was proud of that. That night, I called Ms. Whitfield again. She said, "I think you need to start protecting your assets more actively. And I think you need to talk to someone about your options for having him removed from the property, if it comes to that." It was coming to that. I knew it, even if I hadn't let myself say it yet. The hard part was Becca. Because Becca was not a bad person. She was my daughter and I loved her, and I could see that she was caught in something she didn't fully understand. She made excuses for Scott the way she'd always done. When I gently mentioned once that he seemed to have a lot of time on his hands, she'd gotten defensive and said he was dealing with a lot of stress, and I didn't understand the job market right now. I didn't push. I didn't want to push her away. But I also started noticing things about how she was around him. She'd stop talking mid-sentence if he walked into the room. She'd check his face before she agreed to anything, even small things. "Do you want more coffee, Mom?" "Oh, actually," glancing at Scott, "actually I think we need to get going." I recognized that checking. I'd seen it in other women and I'd never thought I'd see it in my daughter. I talked to my pastor about it. He was careful and kind. He suggested a family counselor. I called one. Becca said she'd think about it. She never followed up. What I did instead, what I felt I had to do instead, was start preparing. I moved my most important documents out of the house. My will, Harold's life insurance payout documents, my investment account records, my deed. I brought them all to Ms. Whitfield's office and asked her to hold them for me. I moved the bulk of my liquid savings to a new account Scott didn't know about, at a different bank, one I'd never mentioned. I put a credit freeze on my accounts. I changed all my passwords and set up 2-factor authentication on everything. My friend from church, Rosemary, she works in cybersecurity and she helped me set it all up one afternoon over sweet tea. Then, because Ms. Whitfield had suggested it and because something in my gut had said it was time, I went to a hardware store and I bought 2 small security cameras. The kind that look like smoke detectors. I put one in the hallway outside my office and one in the kitchen, angled toward the counter where I normally left my mail. I did not tell Becca. I did not tell Scott. I set them up on a Thursday while they were both out. It took me 2 hours and 3 YouTube tutorial videos and 1 call to my nephew Marcus. Wait, I'm sorry, not Marcus. I'm thinking of someone else. I called my nephew Troy, who is patient with technology questions, and didn't ask me why I needed to know. The cameras fed to an app on my phone. I could see both angles in real time from anywhere. I watched for 2 weeks and saw nothing dramatic. Scott in the kitchen at odd hours, opening cabinets, standing in front of the refrigerator too long, trying the office door handle. I caught this on camera now, not just in my memory, twice on a Friday and once the following Monday. But nothing that rose to the level of what happened next. It was a Tuesday. The cardiologist appointment, the quiet garage, the side door. I stood in the laundry room and I listened to my son-in-law move through my kitchen, and then I heard him go down the hall, and then I heard the very specific sound of my office door opening. He had a key. I don't know where he got it. I don't know when. Maybe he'd had a copy made of the spare I keep in the junk drawer. I'd forgotten about that spare. Maybe he'd gotten it made weeks before. I stood there in the laundry room with my cardiology paperwork in my hands, and I listened to my office door open, and I felt something cold move through me. I didn't confront him. I walked back out the side door as quietly as I'd come in. I sat in my car in the garage, and I called Ms. Whitfield. She didn't answer. I left a message. Then I called the non-emergency police line. I explained the situation. I explained that someone was in my home without my permission, specifically in a room that contained a locked safe, and that I had reason to believe. I chose my words very carefully. That this person was attempting to access property that did not belong to them. The dispatcher was calm. She took my address. She said she'd send someone to check on the situation. Then I sat in my car and I watched the camera feed on my phone. He was in my office. I could see the hallway camera angle. The door was open. I couldn't see inside the room from that angle, but I could see the light spilling out into the hall and I could see his shadow moving. He was in there for 11 minutes. I know because I watched every single one of them. Then his shadow moved differently. He was going toward the closet, and then I heard it, even from the garage, even through the closed door into the house. I heard the sound of metal on metal. A scraping, rhythmic, effortful sound. I had seen a pry bar in the U-Haul when they'd moved in. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. The police arrived 9 minutes later. 2 officers, a man and a woman. I met them in the driveway. I explained, quickly, clearly, the way I'd been rehearsing in my head. That this was my home, my son-in-law was inside without my knowledge, and I believed he was attempting to break into my safe. I showed them the camera footage on my phone. The woman officer watched it, and her expression didn't change much, but her partner looked at me and gave a very slight nod. I led them in through the front door. He was still in the office when we got there. I heard him before I saw him, still working at the safe, still that scraping sound. And then we were in the doorway and the female officer said his name, his full name, and the sound stopped. The look on his face when he turned around. Not consciously, not deliberately, but somewhere in the back of my mind I'd imagined what it might look like when he finally got caught. I'd imagined satisfaction. Maybe even anger. What I actually felt standing in the doorway of Harold's old study with 2 police officers behind me, watching my son-in-law's face go from shock to calculation to something that tried to look innocent and failed completely, what I felt was tired and sad. Sad in a way that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with my daughter. He said, "This isn't what it..." He had a pry bar in his hand. He had scratched the paint around the safe door. The key lock, the one that required both the code and the physical key, was scored and dented. He had not gotten in. But he had tried very hard. the officers asked him to put down the pry bar. He did. They asked him to step out of the room. He did, slowly, and as he passed me in the doorway he said, very quietly, "I can explain this to Becca." I said, "I'm sure you'll try." He was not arrested that day. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect a cleaner ending than the one real life delivers. Breaking and entering has specific legal definitions, and because he had been residing in the home, because he had some claim, however thin, to being a resident, the situation was complicated in ways the officers explained carefully, and that I only half absorbed. What they did do was make a report. What I did was call Ms. Whitfield the moment they left and tell her everything. She said, "Good. Now we move." What followed was 3 weeks of paperwork and phone calls and one very difficult conversation with my daughter. Ms. Whitfield filed a formal complaint and helped me document the property damage to the safe. We had the camera footage. We had my notebook with 14 weeks of documented incidents. We had the bank statement incident and the mail incident and the key, which he'd apparently gotten from the junk drawer exactly as I'd suspected. And we had the footage of him trying the office door handle on 4 separate occasions. The conversation with Becca happened on a Sunday morning. I had called Kyle the night before, and he drove up from Columbus and sat at my kitchen table and held his sister's hand while I showed her the camera footage on my laptop. She watched it without speaking. When it finished, she sat very still for a long moment, and then she started to cry. Not angry crying, not defensive crying, just this quiet, exhausted grief, like someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has finally been given permission to put it down. She said, "I knew something was wrong." I kept telling myself I was imagining it. I reached across the table and took her hand. Kyle had his arm around her. We sat there for a while, the 3 of us, the way we used to sit around this same table when the kids were young and Harold was at the head of it. And outside the window, my garden was going dormant for fall, and the neighbor's labradoodle was barking at something in the leaves. Scott left the house that same week. He did not go quietly. There were phone calls, there were texts to Becca that she showed me, there was one appearance at the front door on a Wednesday evening that required a second call to the police. But he left. Ms. Whitfield's strongly worded letter about civil action for property damage and the existing police report, combined with the credit freeze and the documented evidence, made it very clear to him that his options were narrowing rapidly. Becca stayed with me for another 2 months. We watched old movies on the couch. I taught her Harold's pot roast recipe. She cried sometimes at night, and in the mornings she was steadier. She found a therapist, a good one, a woman in her 50s who worked with people leaving difficult relationships. And she started going every Wednesday. I drove her the first few times. In February, she got her own apartment, a 1-bedroom in Kettering, not far from the dental office. It has big windows and a small balcony, and she put a bird feeder on it and calls me to tell me what she sees. I had the safe repaired and the code changed and a new key made. I had the locks rekeyed throughout the house. I bought a proper security camera system this time, installed professionally, with a little monitor on my nightstand that shows all 4 exterior angles. My nephew Troy says I've become a one-woman cybersecurity operation, and I told him he's not wrong. There are things I wish I'd done differently. I wish I'd trusted my instincts sooner. That first week when Harold's armchair happened, and I told myself it was just a chair, I think some part of me knew then. We tell ourselves stories to keep the peace, to hold things together, to protect our children even when our children are grown. I told myself a lot of stories in those first months. But I also know I did what I had to do. I protected myself. I protected what Harold and I built together over 31 years, and I protected my daughter, even when protecting her meant letting her see something she didn't want to see. Becca called me had a good day. A patient she'd been working with for months had finally gotten through a complicated procedure, and Becca had held her hand through the hard part, which is very Becca. It's always been very Becca. She sounded like herself. She sounded clear and easy, the way she'd sounded before all of this, the way she'd sounded when she was young and she'd call me from college just to talk. After we hung up, I sat for a while in Harold's armchair. Because it's mine too, it always was. And I looked out the window at the bird feeder Patty had given me as a late Christmas present. And there were two cardinals on it, a male and a female, taking turns. I thought about how Harold used to say that the hardest thing about love was knowing when to hold on and when to open your hands. I'm still learning that. At 64, I'm still learning. But I kept my house. I kept my daughter. And some mornings that is more than enough.